Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix. I'm super excited because today I'm starting my series, what I call The Writer's Writer, where I talk about writing and the things that I've learned as a writer and talking about a lot of the fun things that writers get to do. And so I thought I would start off by talking about Philip K. Dick, a science fiction writer who is most famous for books such as Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was the basis for the film Blade Runner, as well as his short story Minority Report and Total Recall, which are stories he also wrote and published. And there are many others, such as the book and movie A Scanner Darkly, as well as even the movie Paycheck. And so I have actually a couple of his books here. I have A Scanner Darkly, which was one that I read last year, which I thought was really cool. And then I have one that I just read called Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said. I also have the Library of America version of his books, which includes Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, as well as Ubik and The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. And I love his writing. And I thought that I would start by doing a kind of exploration or case study or deep dive into his work in terms of how that relates to writing. And so there's a lot that could be said. Philip K. Dick is very wide thinking. He casts his net wide. But you also feel like when you're reading his books, like you're reading his books. Like he has that very unique signature. And one thing I would say that I think that any writer should be aware of, it's one thing to have your kind of far-flung fantasies or visions about deep space and about deep time and about the world and the universe. And it's often really fun because in a book like A Scanner Darkly, he postulates the theories of split minds, where individuals are actually multiple minds. And he does this in a variety of ways, discussing the idea in his book, A Scanner Darkly. But I feel like even though that's an important element, there's something else that might be missed as to why he's able to have such imaginative flights of fancy in his writings, why he really is one of the best science fiction writers that has ever lived. And it's interesting because I think he's doing something really unique. Two things that I don't think are easy, but I think that are definitely worth thinking about in your own writing. One is the fact that he is writing fast-paced narratives. You could argue whether they're fast-paced. I find them to be very suspenseful, like sci-fi thrillers. And even though obviously that translates in a quicker way on film and in media such as film, that in the books it's the same thing. It's like reading a thriller. It's like you want to know what's going to happen next. So he does that, but he juxtaposes that with what I would describe to be a very unique way of writing. And it's not just the story and the narrative, which is very fast-paced and interesting, but also his writing, which is very unique. Some people are turned off by poetry because they don't find it to be as interesting as other mediums of writing, if assuming they even like mediums of writing at all. But Philip K. Dick, especially in books like Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said, he's inventing words. He's inventing ideas and concepts through words. He's postulating things. This is what speculative fiction is able to do at its best. It's able to imagine new horizons. It's able to imagine new things to think about. And so I love that his words feel almost poetic. They almost feel like poetry because of the way in which he's capturing new things with language. It's like the pure language of it. And so it's one thing to focus on the story in which you're writing. But it's quite another thing to focus on the words you're using and the effect that those words have. And I don't think this is easy to do. Philip K. Dick is an interesting writer because he struggled most likely with schizophrenia, or at least some diagnosis. But then there's also the other element where not only did he have schizophrenia, potentially, but he also struggled with substances in his life, What's fascinating is A Scanner Darkly is actually the attempt to not glamorize drugs, to practice sobriety and preach sobriety. But it's interesting because he has this like far out imagination that has come from his experiences, and that probably was fueled to some degree by his drug use. But that is still not the only element of what makes his writing interesting. What makes it interesting is the words that he uses. The words are very deliberate and they're very calculated. And there are times where you really have to think about them because they almost don't make sense. And you have to puzzle with it because it's like a puzzle. And I think that's an interesting way of going about things, mostly because it's one thing to paint that picture with words in general. It's another thing to be very deliberate about the words that you're using and what those words are denoting. And so this is what I would say, as a writer's writer, as someone who writes, but also likes to think about writing from a meta perspective or a philosophical perspective, something that has been done in literature, such as in the postmodern writings of writers like Italo Calvino and Jorge Luis Borges, where they're able to experiment with the words that they're using to let the words themselves represent what they're actually trying to say. And so a good way to describe what I'm saying and what I think is important here is that you want to think about the words that you're using. What kind of writing can you make if instead of just focusing on the words as a means to an end, you look at it from the words of what they actually denote, which might feel a little bit more analytical, but I think it's important to think about. Because in my practice of writing, I incorporate a lot of poetry into what I'm doing. I use words in a way that is more poetic. I remember getting critiqued from quite a few different sources where they felt like my ideas or that my writing was too ambiguous because I was treating the words not as prose, but as poetry. But this is what I would say. This is an underutilized and underestimated tool, and something that I think Philip K. Dick does really well. His writing could just be straightforward science fiction, which is fascinating as it is. But what about when the words themselves capture an emotional or mental state? What about when the words themselves actually capture an idea or a concept that you're trying to express? And so it isn't just a means to an end. This is one of the fun things of the postmodern idea, being that language is not transparent, that language is actually very ambiguous and messy. If you want to take the Derridian term of language and say that it's signifiers all the way down, where you're never able to actually hit on what the words are saying. So these are very opposed views, because I do think the other view would be a more traditional view of like writers like Stephen King, who are very focused on narrative and plot. And you would even argue actually with Stephen King, it's actually more character driven. But the point is, it's not so much the words as it is the narrative you're composing. But the reason why this is so important here is like, I want to think about this in my own writing, for one thing, but I want to present the idea for discussion, for thought, to think about what if your prose writing or your narrativizing was more poetic. Of course, you can disagree with this because there are many applications of a more traditional approach. But Philip K. Dick is interesting because he's right in the middle of that divide, where his words feel so unique, even though his books are very fast-paced and he's looking at it from the whole picture of narrative. And so what I would say is the reason why Philip Kindred, I think, is such a great example of a writer is because of that tension between words and plot, between words and narrative. And this is one of the things that I think makes writing so fascinating, is that writing is narrative, and narrative is open-ended. You could even argue, as in the case of Samuel Beckett, that writing isn't even about narrative. This kind of oceanic consciousness, you could say. This kind of this very abstract way of writing. But it's important because this is part of the debate on what makes good writing. And I would venture to say that it's a little bit of both. Philip Kindred has found a way to narrativize, to make it transparent in that sense, where you kind of are curious about what's going to happen next. But he's using the words themselves to denote ideas that are very far out and that require a lot of thought, where the words are poetry, where the words do force you to think about their meanings. And I think what's fascinating but very difficult to do is that a lot of writers like Philip K. Dick are able to definitely write in such a way as to invent concepts that have never been experienced or explored before with words. And that makes sense because of how creative language actually is as a medium. And I am fascinated by this idea and want to think about it some more of like how I can apply this to my own practice. But why don't you ask yourself that question as a writer, as a thinker, as someone who reads books? What if you're able to experiment with that boundary of more straightforward, transparent narrative and the ambiguity of language? Because I do think it becomes like poetry. And this has been one of the funnest elements that I've discovered in my own writing, which is that sure, I might sometimes take a more traditional approach. I do think about rules, and I do follow rules. There is no denying that. I do that in my writing. But some of my favorite writing is actually when all of that breaks down, and it's just the words themselves on the page that you're trying to intuit and understand and interpret. And this, to me, hits to the heart of what is so fascinating about writing, which is that the words can do many different things because they have many different functions. And I just want to encourage you to think about it in terms of your prose, which is, what if the words are denoting something that is twofold or threefold, something that you didn't even realize at the beginning but that you feel within you, where the words aren't just talking about characters and pushing the plot forward, but instead are really thinking about what the words mean and what they're actually saying. And that's why it's twofold or threefold or fourfold, because you're able to look at it as a layered way of writing, and you're able to look at it in a new way. And I think that that's super fascinating. So I love Philip K. Dick's writing. I think that he is an interesting writer because of the way in which he thinks about the words. And I don't think that that's easy to do. And it might be that some of these words come from his experiences, but there is a way in which, as you're reading his writing, it often feels as though it is very intuitive and unique to Philip specifically as a writer, to where it isn't just this obvious thing that the writing is denoting. It's like you really have to wrestle with it and think about it. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. I hope you enjoyed this case study with thinking about Philip Kindred and kind of his ideas and ways of writing. And yeah, as the writer's writer, I want to encourage people to think about new ways of writing. I want to encourage people to think about new ways of reading. And I definitely want to continue to explore this rich realm and world of literature that I think is so incredibly fascinating. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. I hope you enjoyed. I hope to definitely do a lot more of these episodes on my channel. And I hope that you'll check out my other videos and check out my books. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.